The Honourable David Clark.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. For those who think this is a somewhat dry subject and unimportant, we should reflect on the fact that the election of George W. Bush in his first election, when he beat the Democratic candidate Al Gore, was effectively an outcome of improper purging of the rolls in Florida. And what happened in Florida in that election was that the Republicans, who didn't want people who they thought were more likely to vote Democrat to be able to vote, went through the electoral rolls and they struck out people who had the same name as people who were in prison. And in the process, they struck out a lot of Bill Smiths that weren't criminals and were not in prison and had not been imprisoned, and they struck out the wrong people. But the effect of it was that those people lost the right to vote because they were not on the electoral roll, and that could have been the difference in the Electoral College in Florida, which was the difference in the electoral outcome, which foisted upon the world George W. Bush, who was not a force for good. He was a force for overall the world going backwards, Mr Speaker, including in the likes of Iraq with continuing effects in Syria. So electoral rolls are incredibly important. And around the world, you always see the swing about a central point, depending on whether you have a right-wing government or a left-wing government. Because a lot of the people who are less likely to be correctly on the roll, who are more likely to have insecurity of accommodation and therefore be moving around, are more likely to be left-leaning voters than right-leaning voters, and therefore there is an electoral advantage to having a narrow roll for the right and an electoral disadvantage for the left if you've got a narrow roll. And we see that, I think, now in the last few years. Now, I'm not saying that this national government is as bad as the Republican Party were in Florida, but they still do things that curb the ability of us to have as fulsome a role as we should have in New Zealand to enable people who have got as much right as me to participate in the political process, as much right as any of us here, and yet they're prevented to because they're not on the roll. How could we fix this in New Zealand? You know, there's a lot of Scandinavian countries now use the IRD system. Virtually everyone in New Zealand has an IRD number. You've got to have an IRD number if you've got a student loan. You've got to have an IRD number if you're on a benefit. You've got to have an IRD number if you're a superannuitant. You've got to have an IRD number if you're in employment. Virtually everyone in New Zealand has an IRD number. Why can we not use IRD numbers as being a legitimate representation of your ability to vote? Some Scandinavian countries put a year of birth next to everyone's IRD number so that my IRD number would be the same, but it would have 1960 in it, which makes it a little bit harder for someone who is 16 or someone who is 80 to impersonate me. It actually is a good way that you could move against. I leave a fair range in the middle there, but it's a consequence of the hole in the top of my head, which didn't used to be there, Mr. Speaker. I think that we need to move to a system that would save money, because at the moment we have all of these people paid money to try and maintain our electoral roll, separate from the IRD system, which could be more cost-effectively done if we utilised the IRD system. I think it is terrible that so many people in New Zealand are disenfranchised from being able to vote. Now, those people, not only are they disenfranchised, theoretically they're in breach of the law because they're meant to be on the electoral roll. Mr. Speaker, I want to mention another thing that isn't fixed by this legislation. Taylor and the Attorney-General is the first decision ever of the New Zealand High Court to give a litigant a declaration for legislation that is in place being in breach of the Bill of Rights. It was an appalling piece of legislation passed through this House following Paul Quinn, a National Party member, bringing forward a members' bill. And what it did is it changed the rule of people who are on short criminal sentences and their ability to vote. It's always been widely accepted in New Zealand, including on this side of the House, that if you're in prison for a long period of time, like 3 years, you lose your right to vote. But they shortened it to any period of imprisonment, and they created injustices again by doing that, according to the High Court. Because if you get a 1-year sentence and it happens to be between 2 elections, you can still vote in each election, but you can't if it's over the period of an election. If you get a non-custodial sentence instead of imprisonment, which would be more likely to happen to someone who's better off in society than someone who is itinerant, who might not be able to satisfy the court that they should have home detention because they've got no home to stay in, then the person who gets home detention can vote, but the person who has been guilty of just such a same seriousness offence cannot vote. And the High Court said, for the first time in New Zealand's history, they criticised the law passed in New Zealand. They gave a declaration that that law was non-compliant with the New Zealand Bill of Rights. This piece of legislation could fix it, but it doesn't. That is wrong in principle, Mr. Speaker. I want to turn to 2 other issues, sir. Jacinda Ardern has already made the point that if you can enrol close to the election, and you can also issue a special vote close to the election, why can't you do both through the same form in an early voting booth? It's a very simple idea. It's a very simple idea. That would enable more people to vote. And I would have thought that is something that the National Party would support. There are some other good things in this legislation, sir. I agree that with the practical remedies advanced in terms of the practical changes being made in allowing advance votes to be counted earlier in the day on voting day, not before voting day. I think that's appropriate. I like the way that we are giving flexibility to the format of forms rather than prescribing their forms. We're just prescribing their content rather than the way in which they're set out. I agree with the Minister that ballot papers are very, very sensitive, because the way in which a ballot paper can be set out could affect the outcome of an election, and I don't think anyone in this Parliament would want Parliament to give away the right to control what ballot papers look like, because that could be politicised more easily if that was the case. Sir, can I return to the point that I made at the start? I think we should be able to use IRD numbers together with a declaration that someone is either a permanent resident or a citizen at the time they vote. That should be enough to enable a person to vote. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.